Hello, everybody. Welcome to ELNET's Monday briefing. I'm Mark Sachs, one of ELNET's regional directors. I'm going to do something a little differently today. I'm going to make my case for ELNET at the beginning rather than the middle like we often do. And the reason is simple. The U.S. pro-Israel and Jewish communities were rocked by an election outcome that was almost unfathomable a year ago. The election of Zohran Mamdani last week as mayor of New York has major implications for ELNET. And while there are plenty of concerns or reasons to be concerned about Mayor Mamdani, the one most pertinent to ELNET is that he is illustrative of the negative trends within US politics that will make ELNET's work that much more consequential. 22 years ago, Islamic terror struck a serious blow to the soul of this country by bringing down the Twin Towers in New York City. Last week, one of their ideological cohorts captured New York City through an election after writing an abhorrent of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, unlike anything we've ever seen in the United States. He made it not just okay, he made it popular to hate Jews and hate Israel. For years, Americans looked to Europe with ridicule for what countries like the UK, France, and Belgium, just to name a few, allowed to take root there. We scoffed at Europe's eyes while willfully ignoring what was taking place here at home. In fact, just 6 months ago, it was common for us to hear the objection that Europe was lost. Why bother? What importance is Europe to Israel? Well, riding on the heels of Mamdani are fellow travelers who are throwing their hats into the election ring, using the exact same tactic. I'm against Israel and for affordability, feeling confident to insinuate I don't take money from the Jews. The costs of being pro-Israel in the Democratic Party right now are just too great for some to withstand. That means the probability that the squad becomes the power makers in Congress has increased. And if that weren't bad enough, we're seeing rising anti-Semitism in parts of the MAGA movement. So what happens when Israel leaves the US Congress? Because the left-wing squad and right-wing MAGA find agreement on hate for Israel. The other evening, I attended an event featuring a prominent pro-Israel figure in the pro-Israel system. And I was astonished when he warned that we, American Jews, need to find a plan B. I don't know if he meant that honestly or if he said it for effect, but I'll take this point as it pertains to the US-Israel relationship. So here's my pitch. Folks, ELNET is plan B. We are your hedge against a US-Israel relationship that may look nothing like it has for the last 5 decades. Italy, Greece, Germany, Poland, and most other Central and Eastern European countries are now the center of gravity for Europe-Israel relationships. We may be seeing a waning in the US-Israel relationship, but ELNET is participating in the waxing relationship with Israel and dozens of European countries. What's more, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Indonesia, and India are all other areas of opportunity where ELNET is playing a role. And to state the obvious, none of these countries like the Mamdani of the world. If there was ever one sign to double down on ELNET and the Europe-Israel relationship, it was last week's election. So with that, I'd like to turn it over, start our briefing and introduce our guest, Lazar Berman, who is the diplomatic correspondent at the Times of Israel. He holds an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University, taught at Saladin University in Iraqi Kurdistan. He is a reserve captain in the IDF's Commando Brigade and served in a Bedouin unit during his active service. Lazar, it's a real pleasure to have you join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the whole ELNET staff, to the organization, a wonderful organization. And I've been at some of the strategic dialogues and used a lot of their experts, in my article. So it's exciting to be here, and thank you to everyone who's logged in today.
So before we jump into some of the international affairs stuff, you're a diplomatic correspondent. So I'd love to get your thoughts as someone on the outside sort of looking in both to Europe and the United States on what I just anything go through your mind that you want to comment on?
Yeah, certainly the where anti-Semitism will play into the politics of the United States, I think, is something that we didn't think we would be asking not that long ago. But I think it reminds us that anti-Semitism has been a driving political force at different times across the West and today in much of the Arab world as well. So it shouldn't shock us, I think, that it continues to be a force that drives politics, which is what makes it distinct in many ways from other types of hatred. And that's why it can't be lumped in, as people often like to do. They like to lump it in with all sorts of other type of bigotry. Anti-Semitism is unique in many ways, in one of them because of its political implications. In terms of Europe, I think you're right that Europe is an important partner for Israel. There's a lot of frustration in Europe right now over their inability to play a role in what is happening in the issue that they've been talking about for the past 2 years, the war in Gaza. And you can see how sidelined the French initiative was and everyone that went with them. There's actually, I was with the political directors and ambassadors from the 3 Baltic countries right now, and they're in Israel right now trying to figure out what role they can play and how Europe and they themselves can be more effective. So I think they've understand that there's been some missteps in terms of they've kind of boxed themselves out of what happens now. And you've mentioned some of those countries like the Middle Eastern countries that Israel has relationships with. So it's the US, the Saudis, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, of course, Qatar. But those are the countries that are really determining, along with Israel, what's going to happen in Gaza. And it's not Europe right now. So that's something I think they realize as well.
Yeah, I want to talk about the Trump's 20-point plan and some of the challenges that it presents. But first, I want to jump on a couple of headlines. Today, Ahmed al-Shara, former jihadist turned statesman, is visiting Washington today. And there are plenty of stories about reformed jihadists or Islamists or radicals, whatever phrase you want to use to describe them. But I'm still not sure what to make of al-Shara. What is your take, and how is Israel looking at where they think Syria can go under his leadership?
Yeah, so I think it's no surprise to your members and to your listeners here that I think people understand what al-Shara's history is, and he was absolutely a dedicated jihadist and was involved in some of the worst organizations and the organizations that the decent world came together to fight against. And now that you see him walking around being accepted into the capitals of the same part of the world, I think it's pretty shocking. Now, there are indications that Shara was making somewhat of a transition himself before he and his forces took over Syria. So there are reasons to believe that he was kind of turning his back on some of the worst chapters of his own history and some of the most brutal movements that he had been associated with, and was looking towards something different. Of course, it can be tactical for sure, but I think that almost matters a little bit. It matters less than people think, because even if it's in his heart he believes what he believed 10, 20 years ago, it's clear that his only chance at surviving in Syria, and let's not forget, the only governments that lasted in Syria were the 2 Assad governments. Everything else, it was revolution after revolution. And he knows that as well. So there's no guarantee that he's even going to be in office, in a year, or be alive in a year. But he knows that his only chance is to get backing from the West and from the pro-Western Middle Eastern countries. And the only way they're going to do that is if they believe that he is going to play the role of the anti-terrorist, of the force that boxes out Iran and also boxes out jihadi movements. So he really doesn't have a choice here. If he decides that he's going to make a sharp turn, obviously Israel will be very capable of striking in once other countries that are propping him up right now pull their funding. He'll be in a very compromised position and really might not be able to withstand other forces within Syria. Of course, the question is what Turkey does. There's an opportunity here for Turkey to not only expand its own influence in the region, to really, improve its position vis-a-vis the Kurds, but also to establish new forms of pressure on Israel. And I think Israel's very aware of that as well. The question is, what should Israel do now that their big friend Donald Trump is accepting Shara? And I think there's opportunities here for Israel, that if Israel is determined to come to some sort of security agreements with Syria, that's probably not the worst option at all. That's even a good option in that they don't have to give up that much, right? Withdraw troops somewhat. They don't have to get off the Hermon. They don't have to give the Golan Heights, of course. And as long as they're able to keep supplying the Druze in Sueda and on the border, and they have a written agreement with Syria, if there's U.S. troops there, that's fine. If there's Turkish troops there, that's a little bit more problematic. But there are opportunities here to keep Syria, or at least this government, in the embrace of the countries that Israel wants to be associated with. So I think Israel is actually moving on this. They started out very hostile to this government, and you see that the attacks and the rhetoric coming out of Israel toward this government have absolutely changed in recent months.
The general theme, I think, of all these questions is they all lead back to Iran. And what I find interesting is Iran and also Hezbollah, neither one accepts no for an answer. And so both trying to reconstitute their military capabilities. Individual I mentioned earlier in my remarks also said he thought it was highly likely there'd be another war between Israel and Iran. And then New York Times, which I read in Times of Israel, also is a report where it seems increasingly likely that Iran and Israel, there will be another round of violence. And at the same time, we're seeing a reconstitution of strength coming from Hezbollah in Lebanon. So the first question I have is about Iran. You know, Iran's source of strength was its proxy system. It wouldn't be a response directly to Iran because of the fear of its entire unleashing its proxy system, which doesn't really exist. So what is Iran actually trying to achieve here? What are its actual strengths and how is Israel looking at its potential strengths and vulnerabilities as it reconstitutes and perhaps another war is inevitable?
Sure. So I think if we just look at the scope of Israeli history, it really hasn't solved any of its security challenges just by military means. So if you can think of its great conventional victories, let's say 1967, within less than a year, you had the war of attrition, and Israel was fighting those same enemies again. It's in some occasionally very intense combat, and of course, you get to the 1973 war. So there is a pattern throughout Israel history and an understanding from the very beginning, and Ben-Gurion understood this, that there's no battle that Israel can win that is going to solve any particular problem. It is going to eventually have to be through diplomatic arrangements that come through the fact that that particular enemy understands that it's not going to be able to defeat Israel, and it will have to deal with Israel as a neighbor and as a partner. So I think it shouldn't be a surprise here that we defeated Hezbollah. There's no question that was a clear victory from Israel for Israel in 2024. The fact that it signed that ceasefire that allows us, or it didn't sign it, Lebanon signed it, but Hezbollah clearly backed it, that allows Israel to continue striking, and they have not done anything since then. Absolutely humiliating for Hezbollah. And the same thing with Iran. Hopefully it was clear that this was not the final battle that we won against Iran. Iran still has the same concerns, paranoias, outlook that it did before. It sees itself as, first of all, the rightful defender of Shiites, of oppressed Shiites, as it sees it in the region. It sees itself even as the rightful leader of the Palestinian struggle, of even the Muslim world. It's highly paranoid about U.S. attempts to overthrow the regime, and it is trying to do what it can to both export its revolutionary ideology and also to ensure its own security. And how did it do that? Those proxies that you mentioned were the perfect tool. They were able to bring their ideology and their and give Iran very loyal and very disciplined allies across the Middle East. That was a huge source of strength. And of course, they saw it as protecting it, that whenever there was a threat, it had proxies that could fight with that threat and deter them. So that was their whole idea of standing up Hezbollah. It protected the Shiites in Lebanon. It was a stranglehold over the Lebanese state. And it was also meant as a deterrent against Israel so that Israel would never attack Iran directly and attack its nuclear program. Obviously, things are very different right now. The proxy network still exists. There's still plenty of loyal, armed Shiites and others across the region. Hezbollah still exists, has most of its weapons, has most of its fighters. The Shiite militias in Iraq, they were just in the news because probably the most powerful of them, Kataib Hezbollah, released Elizabeth Tsurkov. But those are still very powerful or very capable as well. Of course, the Houthis, we haven't heard the last word from them as well. So they still have a network, even though it's cowed, it's demoralized, and it needs to reorganize itself, and it's somewhat on the back foot. I think Iran understands or has come to the conclusion that its ballistic missiles are an opportunity for it. It saw that some dozens got through and struck some sensitive sites in Israel and caused some amount of damage in Israel, caused some casualties in Israel. And they think, oh, this is an opportunity because Israelis' defenses are quite good. They'll knock down 90-something%, but they are still, we can get something through. So it seems like Iran is really doubling, tripling down on that ballistic missile capability and figuring out ways to fire bigger barrages, more powerful barrages, to punish Israel and to deter Israel. So that, I think, is going to be a real line of effort for Iran in the future. And of course, there's the nuclear issue. Right, there's been some IAEA inspectors in last week, but in general, there's really not a lot of understanding of what Iran is up to. There are reports that Iran understands that it lost its 3 main sites, but it's going all out into developing a new site. And without the IAEA in there, we don't have eyes on the ground. Of course, there's intelligence eyes on the ground. We see how extensively Israeli intelligence penetrated Iran. So I'm sure there's a lot of information coming out. I'm sure that Israel has new surprises against Iran should war break out again. But it's absolutely something that continues. Hopefully the Trump administration, of course, Trump himself, for all of his talk about I've made peace, hopefully he doesn't get too convinced by his own language and he understands that these ceasefires can be temporary. And they really need to be protected and supported and buttressed through continued threats and through continued military action. That's absolutely what Israel is doing in Lebanon.
Where is Hezbollah getting its material from? I would have assumed that with Syria sort of off the playing field, that Shia Crescent that Iran tried to, or the land bridge, the Shia land bridge that Iran advantage of would have been severed. Who's supplying Hezbollah? Is it just that they have all these cached up material around for them to recollect, or are they getting new supplies delivered somehow?
So most of their stock right now is what they had before, and that was coming through the seaports and through the airport, which before Israel's victory, they absolutely had their own operatives there and were able to block off, control what came in and out, and make sure that no one was going to get in the way. That doesn't exist anymore. So it's much harder for them. The main route is the land bridge right now. Now you have the Lebanese army, which to some extent is fighting against it, but not that much. And of course, you have the new Syrian army, whose capabilities are limited, obviously hostile to the Iranian axis, and they are publishing pictures of what they catch, but let's not be under any illusion they're not catching everything at all. There are still plenty of forces in Iraq and in Syria that are friendly to the Iranian axis or are part of the Iranian axis, so stuff is still getting through. And of course, there is a domestic production capability that Hezbollah has developed, taught by Iran, but if Iran can do it, Hezbollah can do it. That, of course, is not south of the Litani. The Lebanese armed forces have been operating since September south of the Litani. They have a deadline of the end of the year to clear the area south of the Litani, so just over Israel's northern border, of any Hezbollah weapons. Will they do that? Maybe, it's conceivable, but the big problem is there's 4 more stages to their plan, and that's where most of Hezbollah's weapons were, and that's where most of Hezbollah's weapons are. So, they have these long-range missiles and other caches way up in the Bekaa Valley. Only Israel's dealing with that right now, and that's through airstrikes, and there's a limit to what airstrikes can do.
All right, let's transition to the south. The way I see it, this seems to be the intersection of, or a collision course of of two big trains. One is carrying a hell of a lot of wishful thinking, and the other is carrying a hell of a lot of reality. And at the point, they are on a collision course. And you wrote last week, I found it interesting. You wrote, quote, after much excitement around the ceasefire in Gaza last month, plus no small measure of pomp and circumstance, U.S. President Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan has lost much of its momentum. So let's kind of start broadly, and then we can delve into some of the specific. Where are the various collision points as you see it, or the friction points where this is going to go really wrong, or potentially go really wrong?
Sure. So just in general, Trump's approach to this has been kind of like a bicycle. As long as there's still momentum, it's not going to fall over. So he's really his approach, and Jared Kushner's here right now, is to make sure that none of these things, and they're not really very small violations. They're pretty big topics each in and of themselves, but he says the bigger issue is to make sure that it keeps moving forward, that we don't get hung up on anything. So if it's the fact that in the first 72 hours, Hamas was supposed to hand over not only all the living hostages, but all 28 bodies, and they handed over 0 of them, still Israel gave back all the terrorists and the other prisoners it was supposed to before it got a single body back. This issue of the 100 to 200 Hamas terrorists in Israeli-controlled territory in Rafah, he's trying to make sure that this doesn't blow up the ceasefire, and that we could even see these terrorists disarming and then going back to Hamas-controlled territory. Pretty crazy to imagine, but that seems to be what the discussions are about right now. Those are pretty big topics, and you can see how. And it's not really a crazy position from the Americans. They're saying, listen, we're going to get to disarmament. We're going to get to something different. We just have to move forward. We can't get hung up on this. Now, the first phase, which is the only phase that either Hamas and Israel actually signed on, was supposed to be the easy one. And you see how difficult just this is. So the fact that we haven't even gotten to talking about the second phase, you can imagine how difficult it's going to be. So where will it be difficult? You mentioned friction points, but I think you'd have to talk about friction points not only between Israel and the US, but also between Israel and Egypt, between Israel and Turkey. So there's plenty of friction points, but let's start with the US and Israel. A big friction point, which is behind us, is the fact that there was a lot of desire amongst some parts of Israel's populace is to see new settlements, to see the emigration of Gazans. That seems to be off the table. So that's not going to happen. In terms of how, and this I think is the main one, how aggressively Israel can enforce the ceasefire, that seems to be the major disagreement right now with the US. So this is somewhat comparable to what we were talking about in Lebanon, where in Lebanon, Hezbollah doesn't strike back, and Israel is free to do whatever it wants against any perceived threat. Israel would love to have that case be what is operative in the Gaza Strip, but it doesn't have that yet. It doesn't have a side letter from the U.S. It would like to get a side letter from the Trump administration guaranteeing that, but it doesn't have it yet. So that, I think, is a very key disagreement. Israel, of course, would like to be punishing Hamas for these violations, and it only has had a couple of times where it bombed for a few hours and then went back to the ceasefire. And that even took place after 2 incidents where IDF troops were killed by Hamas terrorists in Rafah. And the fact that it was only a couple hours of bombing, I think, is not something that Israel would have chosen if it didn't have to. So for now, the Trump administration is winning out. There is very robust, very open discussions that are taking place, mainly in Kiryat Gat, but the approach is certainly not agreed upon. Once we get to the second phase, there's going to be disagreements on what is disarmament, who oversees disarmament. There's going to be a disagreement with many of the Arab countries on the role of the Palestinian Authority that Israel is not willing to consider right now, and a lot of other countries, certainly the Arab countries, want to see. So that's for sure. And then the mandate of the security force. Now, I'm pretty down on a security force because it's either going to be countries that are inept, so the forces they're going to send are not going to be especially good, any serious country, let's say the Saudis, who I don't think they're going to send anything, or the Turks, right? They're only going to get in the way of Israel. They're still not going to risk their own soldiers to fight against Hamas. And when Israel wants to operate, there's going to be a risk that Israel injures or kills those soldiers. That turns into a diplomatic problem for Israel. You can take the UNIFIL example, where a lot of diplomatic problems, Israel kind of found a lot of diplomatic challenges because of these forces that drive around, that don't get in the way of Hezbollah, they don't fight with Hezbollah, but they're happy to get in the way of Israel. So I think that is absolutely a challenge that Israel is going to face. There's going to be disagreements with Arab partners. And the fact that this government does not want to countenance the PA being there, well, we might be stuck with Turkey instead. That's not necessarily the trade-off I would make, but that is certainly an area of disagreement that's going to expand moving forward.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of square pegs in round holes here that are irreconcilable. I remember reading, I don't know if it was an Emirati, but it was an Arab official not too long ago who squarely said, why should we put our men on the ground to fight Hamas when the U.S. isn't doing it themselves? Now, I think the basis of that argument is, or the premise of that is absurd. Perhaps it's because it's your backyard and this is something you care about, but if no countries are willing to take on Hamas, then the only country that's going to take on Hamas is Israel, and it doesn't seem like we can get past that barrier at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. Of course, you know better than anyone else what the mood is in the U.S. in terms of boots on the ground in the Middle East, boots on the ground to fight for Israel, even more combustible in the Republican Party right now. So that's not going to happen. But yeah, I mean, these countries in the Middle East want Hamas defeated. But we know the way they operate. The Saudis have been aggressive in the past decade in terms of pushing back against enemies. They led that Yemen campaign that maybe we should have let it play its way out, and then we wouldn't have this Houthi problem. But they're not going to do that in Gaza. They're not going to be seen as fighting Palestinians. There's just there's too many downsides for them, and that's the way these countries are. So you're right; it's going to fall on Israel. The question is whether through stiff action now Israel can forestall a future conflict. But it seems like the world doesn't understand that sometimes a short, intensive operation will forestall something much bigger. Of course, had Israel gone to war in 2017, 2018, of course, the world would have bashed Israel and condemned Israel, but it would have prevented October 7th and the subsequent war. But that's the way it is. So, hopefully we're looking at a short, intense, contained operation that gets everyone's attention and deters Hamas to allow those countries to really disarm it. But we know that those words of deterrence and disarming and international peacekeepers don't have a great record around Israel.
Since you mentioned the PA and the role of the Palestinian Authority, I want to ask you about a Politico article I read, Politico Europe, and it referenced former Shin Bet directors Ami Ayalon and Yaakov Perry, both of whom say they called it, I'm saying Trump's plan had more holes than Swiss cheese, with the biggest hole being that there's no commitment to a two-state solution. Now, I find that a bit surprising and perhaps, dare I say, but these are Israeli Shin Bet directors, so who am I to question? Do they reflect, or what is their belief widely held in Israel that is something that should be addressed at this stage of the game?
No. Short answer, no. Yeah, there are absolutely Shin Bet leaders who tend to come out and to be very kind of in favor of a two-state solution and critical of what some have even called occupation. But there is absolutely no appetite in Israel for anything like a two-state solution. I'm not even talking about the right. You had President Herzog he was in Davos and he said it publicly. No Israeli in their right mind is thinking about a two-state solution right now. You don't see Yair Golan, who is the left marker for the Zionist parties. He's Meretz and Labor. He's not pushing for it. Nobody's running on that. Nobody wants to see it. Nobody would vote for it. It's just not something that you hear. So, it's a non-starter. I think, it's good that it's not in there. There are certainly other holes in the plan, though, and some of them I alluded to is,
Mhm.
the details of the security force. What on earth does disarmament mean? Um, you know, how do you actually get Hamas to give up its governance instead of being behind the scenes and choosing who rules? We're at a point where you could actually see this headed in a problematic direction where it's basically October 6th, where you have Hamas in control of an area that feels like it is immune from an decisive Israeli operation. Of course, they're in control of a much smaller Gaza, but that obviously they're very good at figuring out how to threaten Israel after Israel, either carries out an operation or installs new defensive measures. So we have to make sure we don't head in that direction. Everything from this government has promised that it wouldn't happen. But of course, that middle area of how do we get to that what Trump has promised, that promised reality of Hamas disarmed, Gaza demilitarized, and a new governance in Gaza. How do we get there? That's the big question. That's where there are plenty of holes.
Um, you've written a few articles over the last few weeks that I found very interesting. So here's one I want to get into. I know a lot of our guests are very interested in Qatar and Turkey, so I'm going to go in that direction here because you wrote an article just a week or two ago, and you wrote they're the emerging Sunni Islamist bloc, quote, and what makes this access so problematic over the long term is not that it is creating terrorist armies in the region as Iran did. It is that both Turkey and Qatar enjoy close ties and enthusiastic support from Washington, drastically limiting Israel's options if it decides to counter their designs. Now, you went into that just a moment ago. Israel does not want Turkey, I don't believe, Gaza at all. Where do you see the real tension points here? And how closely do you think President Trump will stand with Israel on this and builds alliances with Erdogan?
Yeah, so there's this strange bromance between Erdogan and Trump. I don't understand how it happened because Erdogan doesn't really speak English. I'm not, he must have the best translator, in the world to be able to create this. But, I've asked Trump
She's
directly.
blonde and beautiful.
Right, it could be. It could be. So, I've asked Trump directly about the Turkish role, about the Qatari role, and he has been very, very positive about them. So he thinks he has, partners that he can work with, and it's true. They do absolutely uh, represent an asset right now for the U.S. in terms of mediating in Gaza and doing other things that the U.S. wants. The Qatar relationship is a continuation of previous administrations. The Biden administration was obviously very, very big on Qatar as well. So that's a challenge for Israel because you keep hearing senior administration officials saying that Turkey has a role to play. I asked JD Vance when he was here, what was it, 2 weeks ago, about the Turkish role. He said that Israel would decide which troops or which countries have boots on the ground in Israel. But Turkey has a positive role to play. So it was kind of an answer that was self-contradictory. We see that Turkey, on every crisis that comes up, including these terrorists in the tunnel, Turkey is there as a mediator. So they have really pushed themselves in. And yeah, they are Hamas supporters. They refuse to call Hamas terrorist organization. They host Hamas. A bright spot here and maybe a silver lining here is the fact that Egypt really does not like Turkey. They almost went to war over gas in the East Med, over Libya. About half a decade ago, there's been a warming of relations, but there's still some serious tension between the two. A lot of the Muslim Brotherhood Egyptians that are outlawed and might even be executed in Egypt broadcast criticism of Sisi from Turkey. So there is no love lost there. Egypt wants to be the dominant player in Gaza. It needs the money that's going to come from that. So the more we can do to keep Egypt in and Turkey out, the better off. I think Israel realizes that as well, but we really have to make that case in the halls of power in Washington.
I'm going to ask you another question, and then I'm going to open it to some questions. So I want to remind everybody to please submit your questions to the chat that Randy had opened up. So let's talk about Qatar. I think its duplicity is pretty remarkable, or its success being duplicitous is pretty remarkable. If you were an Al-Thani relative responsible for strategic planning for Qatar, what is going through your mind? How would you be positioning Qatar right now in this world? Aligning with who and towards what goal?
Yeah, I think the approach would be what it has been because it's been very successful. Um, First of all, recognizing that the world needs fossil fuels, and that's how it continues to need. So natural gas, with the way that Europe has kind of misplayed their hand there, and they're either reliant on Russian, American, or Qatari natural gas. That means their funds are basically unlimited. They played their influence campaign very well. So in terms of the World Cup, and positioning themselves as the indispensable mediator. There's other countries that want to be mediators. Egypt has played that role, Oman, but Qatar has really showed itself that it knows how to do this, whether it's with the Hamas issue, whether it's with the Taliban, whether it's with Iran. They've really positioned themselves well, and I think I would continue to play that card. The problematic side is their ideological side, their support for the Muslim Brotherhood, which caused the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, to kick them out in 2017. The Saudis did everything but declare war on Qatar, so even no food could go through Saudi Arabia to Qatar. So the Muslim Brotherhood is absolutely seen as a threat amongst the pro-Western Middle Eastern states besides Qatar and Turkey. So they, I think, are continuing to successfully do this pragmatism where they know what they stand for, but they are willing to take the position they need to in any given crisis. So whether it's funding universities, whether it's maintaining a pretty robust relationship with Israel over the years, all of that is to make sure that their influence is growing, that they are positioning themselves as a small country but an indispensable country. And I just want to say something about the relationship with Israel. It goes back to the 90s. There was a trade office in Israel that survived the Second Intifada. It was only closed during Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009. There were all sorts of other cooperations. Of course, this Qatari money going into Hamas at Israel's request. That they obviously cooperated very closely on that. The World Cup had Israeli diplomats in Doha. And of course, all of this mediation, there's really close ties between Israel's security forces or intelligence services in Qatar and other diplomats as well. So it's not only that Qatar is playing duplicitous roles, that Israel hasn't decided how it wants to approach Qatar. It's a country that Israel struck in September, but it's also a country that continues to be at the center of what Israel wants to do in the region. So, and must I remind you that it's still not clear how much influence they had in the circle around Netanyahu. There's still the Qatargate scandal going, when they certainly were in touch with some advisors of Netanyahu. The question is, how much did that affect Israeli decision-making? How much did that affect how Israel approached Egypt? Because there were some very strange episodes about Egypt where all of a sudden there was anonymous Israeli officials talking about the Egyptian threat in the Sinai and things like that. So there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, but Qatar is playing its cards well, and I think it'll continue that same approach that it has. And I think it realizes that it overstepped in 2017, and that's why it is maintaining much more positive relationships with the other Gulf countries, even though they do see it as a rival as well.
I don't know if we're going to have time, but if we do, I'd love to circle back to the about Egypt. But before that, I want to put the juxtaposition between al-Shura in Syria and the Al-Thani family in Qatar. Al-Shura is willing to forego Islamist ideology to reform Syria. The Al-Thani family is immensely wealthy, as is every other Qatari. They seem to have the wealth and influence that any country would want. I'm failing to understand why they still hew to the Islamist ideology and what they get. Again, juxtaposing someone like al-Shara, who is on the battlefield dying for his ideology, and the Al-Thani family who is funding it, where the actual gain is for them. I don't know, something you can respond to, but I find it an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that people actually believe in things. You know, we have to take people's religious ideologies seriously sometimes. If you want to look at it from a realpolitik perspective, there was absolutely, what was it, 15 years ago, where it looked like the Muslim Brotherhood was the wave of the future. So Turkey, Egypt, right? They held Egypt for a year. So there's certainly a lot of potential power in the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the largest organized opposition movement in many countries. So it definitely gives them a lot of, just like you talked about the proxies that Iran has, gives them a lot of potential proxies in the region. But there's also a belief element to it, I'm sure, as well.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a question here from Kenneth Friedland, and it's to your comment about diplomacy after we talked about, while we were talking about Iran as being important to complement the military victories. And I think he was struck by your reference of diplomacy with a country like Iran that's dead set against Israel's destruction, and implacably holding on to those beliefs. Can you talk about what you meant by how Israel is supposed to engage in diplomacy with a country like Iran?
Yeah, Israel doesn't want to engage in direct
Not directly,
diplomacy.
but
Yeah, certainly not. It's diplomacy with the countries that are involved in what happens in Iran. So that's the E3, right? Germany, France, and the UK. Obviously, the France and UK side have been a little bit rocky since the Palestine recognitions of September. But the French are probably at times they've been tougher than the US on Iran, and they certainly, there's no love lost there as well. So we have to make sure that we get those relationships right. And of course, all of the Middle Eastern countries that feel threatened by Iran, there's a lot of work to do there. Now, at some point, the hope is that this regime will collapse, and then obviously that will change everything. I don't think there's much Israel can do in that regard, but we are not able to prevent Iran rearming if they choose to rearm, right? We can't carry out airstrikes every day. There's a limit to it, but we have to make sure that our diplomacy is coordinated with the people it needs to be coordinated. Most important, of course, is the Trump administration. If this Gaza war doesn't restart and things kind of move in a very positive direction like Trump wants, then it'll be much easier to work with the French and the British, probably more closely than before, because they will have appreciated what we did in terms of our strikes and our intelligence, and it will have much more credibility. Working with the IAEA as well. We just because we disagree with a lot of organizations doesn't mean we can't have that doesn't mean they're important, and we can't use them as assets. There's no point in antagonizing organizations unnecessarily. So there's a lot of diplomacy to be done, and I think we have to realize that right now, as always, the credible threat of military force helps diplomacy. When Iran is afraid, then it's willing to make more deals. And the same thing goes for Hezbollah and Hamas. I fear that Hamas is not especially afraid right now, and perhaps Hezbollah is becoming less so as well. And that is where the diplomacy with Washington needs to take place, to make sure that Washington understands that, Trump understands that, and that we have the legitimacy to act in limited ways if needed in order to restore these ceasefires and to restore these understandings.
Kenneth, I hope that answered your question. I thought it was a good response. So, thank you, Lazar. If anybody else has questions, please submit them. Lazar, you wrote another article where you interviewed Hungary's European Union Affairs Minister. I think it's János Boka. Forgive me if I say that wrong. And he said, quote,
I don't know.
You don't even know either, right? So we'll agree on Janos Boca. If the European Union wants to remain a player in the region, it needs to have a strategic and constructive relationship with the state of Israel. And he also said Europe risks becoming irrelevant in the Middle East if countries continue to pursue policies hostile to Israel. Knowing that they have been left out of Trump's 20-point plan, beyond Iran, holding Iran accountable, and I would also want, I'm curious about France's role with Lebanon. They seem to have vacated Lebanon when Macron was actively involved initially in the peace there, I thought. Where do you see European countries going, or where would you like to see them going right now to assert influence and assert their relationships with Israel? Where do you see
Yeah,
it's most promising?
sure. There is a desire on the part of European countries to have a positive relationship with Israel. Of course, with the exception of the Irish, who have this weird obsession that goes beyond just political, in my opinion. But again, I was talking with the Baltic countries, and they would not stop saying how much they want to maintain a positive relationship with Israel, and they've always backed Israel. Of course, you have the Central European bloc: Hungary, Czech Republic, Austria, Romania, sometimes Italy, even though the Italian people have become very, very obsessed as well with the Palestinian cause. But the government has largely held the line. Of course, Germany. But there's other countries as well. There's plenty. There's plenty. France obviously wants a positive relationship, and even countries like Norway, when you talk to their politicians, they say, of course, we want to have a good relationship with Israel. So if things really do stay calm somewhat in Gaza, then there will be kind of a breath of relief, and I think a desire to move back toward positive things. The threat of EU sanctions just is not going to happen because of it needs all 27 members. So thank God that we have been investing in some of these relationships that can block that. And I think there is an understanding. I spoke to all the EU diplomats, ambassadors in Israel, and the sense I got from them was, yeah, we understand we kind of boxed ourselves out diplomatically on this French initiative, and I'm sure they want to be involved again, and they don't know how to do that. So they will be looking for ways to get on board. And hopefully what they realize is that Trump was able to achieve what they wanted to achieve, right? The whole time they were saying, we need a ceasefire, we need humanitarian aid, we need hostages out. Well, Trump did that because he built such trust with Netanyahu. So when you antagonize Israel, you don't do anything for the Israelis, you don't do anything for the Palestinians. They're certainly doing nothing for their own voters. And when you maintain warm, understanding, open relationship with Israel, then when you actually get done what you want to get done. So if that's the purpose of European diplomacy, then that's the path. If the purpose of European diplomacy is to play domestic politics, which is legitimate in a democracy, then they're going to continue to saying many of the similar things, but they just won't have a role in what happens here, and that trend will only grow.
Well, these relationships don't happen in a vacuum, and ELNET is our raison d'etre to make sure that European countries and Abraham Accord countries and others who want to be associated with these flourishing relationships continue to grow. So we will find our ways to make sure these relationships, diplomatic, defense and security, and economic relationships continue to let's say, boom. So we have no more questions. I want to say before I turn it over to Tom Flish for everybody next week, we've got Jake Wallace-Simons next week, who will join us from the UK. Yeah,
Nice.
Jake is he's good. He's
Great.
very good. So you can join us, Lazar. We'll send you the link if you'd like to join us.
Thank you.
I think you would enjoy it. I've been watching their podcast, The Brink, and he's had on some of my favorite intellectuals to have conversations about what's taking place. So he will join us next week. And with that, I want to say thank you, Lazar. This was really informative. I think the reason why we didn't have questions was because you hit
Mark,
almost every possible.
We have a couple, actually, if you check. We got a few at the last minute.
Oh, okay. All right, let's get Larry Hochberg. He wants to know, isn't the Muslim influence in the UK and France a barrier that will block further cooperation? How do you see the Islamist development in these countries?
I'm not an expert in domestic French or English British politics. It certainly has an effect. There's no question that I think especially Macron was keeping an eye to that as well. But at the same time, there's backlash in some countries. I mean, if you look at the polls with what Reform Party is doing in the UK, I think you'll see that there's certainly a backlash. So I think it's going to continue to be one of the driving forces in European politics, but also, all these things have a pushback as well. So I think it's something that will express itself in different ways.
I like to invoke Newton's third law. I believe it's his third law. Every action has an opposite and equal reaction.
Mhm.
So when you move in one direction too far, you see the counter reaction in an opposite and equal reaction. And as you said, we're seeing that. We're seeing the rise. We're seeing more protests. We're seeing more backlash about in all of those countries. So we'll see where this goes. So with that, I wanted to say thank you, Lazar, really, for your time today and your insights. Really appreciate it. And I'd like to welcome